I will go on to the next speaker, and that is Professor Lisa Waddington, who is the EDF Chair in European Disability Law, who will speak on law looking outward, the past and the future of legal research on disability in Europe. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So indeed, I do have the honour of talking to you about the past and future of legal research on disability in Europe. And I can say that European research on disability law has come on in leaps and bounds since I first started to do research in this field, which was almost 25 years ago. And I'd like to make a few personal reflections about the changes that I've seen over this time. Now, in 1989, I applied to do a PhD in law at the European University Institute of Florence. And I submitted a research proposal about the disability policy of the European Economic Community, and specifically disability and employment. Now, I know that many of you have written PhDs or are writing them, or know people who are writing them, and you will know that PhD researchers struggle to get to grips with the vast amount of literature which they have to cover when they're working on their PhD. For lawyers, there's legislation and case law and books and endless articles, and then there are new developments which keep coming along, which you have to stay on top of. Now, I cannot say that I face this challenge at all. When I started my PhD, there was no European policy or legislation on disability and employment. There was no literature, there was no case law, and when I finished, 3.5 years later, nothing had changed. There was still nothing. So I did read literature during this 3.5 years, but to be honest, it wasn't really relevant. In fact, there was only one book that I found on the topic written by a former staff member of the Disability Unit at the Commission, and he wrote about various non-binding action programs that the Commission had, and that was the extent of disability policy. So you may say, well, what was this PhD of yours about? I quite frankly now, I can tell you it was more a work of fiction than anything else. I made it up. I wrote about what I thought an EC policy on disability and employment should look like, and since no one knew what the policy should look like, there was no one to say that I got it wrong, so they gave me the PhD. Okay. So, this reflects the earliest days of disability law research in Europe. So there was no law or policy to speak of, and certainly none that was inspired by the social model of disability. There were no conferences, there were no publications, there was no one to speak to. So the first researchers in disability law in Europe, we were lowly academics. We were regarded as rather strange by our colleagues, and there we were isolated on our academic island. But things are changing. There's no literature to read on European disability law, but in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was adopted. And that had been preceded in 1973 by another piece of non-discrimination legislation, the Rehabilitation Act. So in the US, there was literature on this new act and also case law under the older act. And in the UK, as well, slow progress was being made towards the adoption of the Disability Discrimination Act. And here in Britain, literature was beginning to emerge too. So in the 1990s, disability law research in Europe moved on. And a few publications began to emerge, and the literature predicted strange and really rather unrealistic developments, as it seemed to us at the time, like the adoption of a Europeans with Disabilities Act, so a European, an EC-EU non-discrimination legislation, or the adoption of a UN Treaty on Disability Rights. And these isolated academics, like Gerard and Theresia de Gagne and myself, we were also, in this time, being brought together by disabled people's organisations to support them in their campaigns and work at European level. So the first large-scale cooperation occurred around the European Day of Disabled Persons in 1995, which resulted in the Invisible Citizens Report. And the papers and arguments put forward in that report form the basis of the successful DPO campaign to include a disability explicit non-discrimination article in the Amsterdam Treaty. So now, in the mid-90s, we had disability law research in Europe involving a small group of individuals, spread all over the continent, but mainly in the north and the west. We were publishing, we were cooperating with DPOs, and we were arguing for development, in favour of developments that, to be frank, seemed way ahead of what was possible and seemed quite unrealistic. Moving on to the present day. We have established researchers who are connected through formal and informal networks in Europe. So researchers are based in disability research centres, like the Centre for Disability Law and Policy at the National University of Ireland in Galway, the Centre for Disability Studies at Leeds University, which also includes lawyers, and we have established chairs in disability law. So Theresa de Geegner now holds the chair in Law and Disability Studies at the Technical University in Bochum, and I hold the European Disability Forum chair in European Disability Law in Maastricht. And then we have networks, and these are both broad disability studies networks, as well as networks which are funded by the EU. We've already heard mention of the academic network of European disability experts, which include lawyers. But here we have a photo of what I think was the first EU-funded network on disability law, the network of experts on disability non-discrimination law. And then those original researchers who set out in this journey in the late 80s and the early 90s have supervised and are supervising PhD researchers who are working on disability law and policy. And I should say today those PhD researchers do have something to research. They do have literature to read. There is policy for them to work on. And here we have, can we go back one? Here we have the DREAM logo, and that is a network of PhD researchers which is funded by the European Union via the Marie Curie 7th Framework Programme. Then we have academic articles and books on disability law, and they are no longer seen as strange, as unusual, but they are part of the mainstream. So in fact, all textbooks on EU law will at least cover today disability non-discrimination law. You would look in vain for any reference to disability in the 90s in those books, but now you will find references. And then the policymakers have caught up with the academics, and we do have ambitious policies which are being explored and thought about at the EU level. So of course, as academics, we continue to contribute to the debate and try and expand the limits of what seems possible, but we're no longer way ahead of the politicians and the policymakers. Academics also continue to work with DPOs at national level, European level and global level. And we know that the topics of research are also changing. So in the 1990s it was necessary to embed the social model of disability in disability law research. And research in the late 90s and the first years of this century concentrated on specific issues like non-discrimination and employment. But today, non-discrimination and equality are not seen as insular topics, but they're linked to all elements of disability law and policy. And also today, research is very much influenced and inspired by the UN Convention. So, legal capacity and personhood is attracting far more attention than it did a few years ago, and the participation of people with disabilities and disabled people's organisations in policy making is also the subject of a lot of research. And both of those topics have been very much influenced by the Convention and the prominence they have in the UN Convention. Then, interdisciplinary research is also emerging. There's still a long way to go, but it is going forward. And participatory research, as we've heard mentioned in the context of the EURAID project, this is also emerging. So we launched the European Yearbook on Disability Law as a forum for publishing all of this kind of research, as well as in order to document and report on the many developments which are occurring within Europe. And a word on the future. I think we are going to see, I hope we are going to see more mainstreaming of disability in research. So that involves the recognition that there is a disability dimension to all kinds of academic research, whether it be criminal law or family law, housing law, property law, whatever. and to bring that disability dimension into that mainstream research. But of course, disability-specific research, just like gender-specific research, will continue to be important, and there will be an emerging group of academics who will continue to work on that. Thank you.